Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Wrap. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, today joined by Chris Hattingh. A quick apology before we begin. I am a little bit ill today, so if I seem a little bit odd, it's simply because of that. But let's get into our first news story of today. And this is news that personally, as a resident of Johannesburg, I am very pleased by, which is that our mayor, Kabelo Gwamanda, has announced that he will be resigning the post of mayor in the city of Johannesburg. Kabelo Gwamanda is from the small Al Jamaah party, which has essentially only been placed in the mayorship. Now, the last two mayors have been from that party due to a compromise between the ANC and EFF in their control of Johannesburg's local government. It looks so far like Kabelo Gwamanda will stay on for a little bit still to come. He has said that he has given his resignation into the Speaker of Johannesburg and that he will soon be vacating the chair once a new special session of the Johannesburg Council is held. It's expected that the ANC is likely to replace him with current finance MMC Dada Marero, who was briefly mayor of the city until a court ruling invalidated his election a little while ago. So it seems as though the impetus for this change in the way things are working is some sort of a negotiated deal between Action SA and the ANC. If Action SA supports the ANC in the Joburg Council, essentially, as long as the ANC has one other partner in the council, the EFF is no longer dispensable. It's entirely dispensable. It's no longer necessary for the ANC maintaining control of Johannesburg. We still don't really know any details. We don't even know if Action SA is indeed going to definitely be backing the next ANC mayoral candidate in Johannesburg. Chris, what do you make of this? Do you think that there has a deal has been signed here? And what do you make of the city of Johannesburg's politics going forward?
Without being privy to any special information, I do think an agreement has been reached. And the reason I say that is, for all the mess around the governance of the city of Joburg, the mayor and others in the former mayor and others in the administration not being sort of on the ground as issues develop and being proactive in that sense. So the impression is not really acting in some sort of coordinated manner. With this sort of arrangement, you try and do this, number one, to assuage or save some kind of face for the former mayor and his party as well, especially because that party is part of the government of national unity. And then secondly, with the local government elections now just 18 months away, always keep that in the back of your mind. Every move you need to try and make now needs to be focused towards that. So you might make the wrong calculations, the right moves, but there needs to be some kind of long-term strategy planning, even if it's just purely consolidating your power base in the city of Joburg so that you continue to have access to resources and influence, contracts, all those sorts of things where possible. There's questions here around the relationship between the provincial and city ANC and that of national ANC, where you've already seen some tension points. Do they work with the EFF or not? You've had the current premier, Panyaza Lesufi, given the massive decline in support for the ANC from around, I think, 50% in 2019 to now, 35%, still remaining in his position despite turning out such an atrocious performance and him trying to consolidate his base in Gauteng and the city of Joburg. So all these things, I think, factor into each other. And I think for businesses and for citizens, we have raised this in the lead up to the elections, but to reinforce it now, if you thought things were going to be stable now, maybe the government of national unity is, for everything it is somewhat stable now, but provincially, there's much to still navigate and figure out. And we might not reach that point of long-term stability anytime soon. You've seen in the last 2 weeks the ructions politically in the Western Cape, in the municipalities of Oudtshoorn and Langeberg, and 9 other municipalities co-governed or in some sort of agreement between the DA and the Freedom Front Plus, potentially at risk of some sort of changes in their leadership. So yeah, provincially and in the metros and municipalities, things are up for grabs at the moment.
Action SA's provincial chairperson, Phunzi Ngobeni, said that Joburg residents have suffered under Mayor Gwamanda's administration, whose ineptitude and habitual blame shifting have led to a disastrous state of service delivery across the city. We look forward to the election of a new competent mayor, and we'll continue with our efforts to stabilize governance and service delivery in Johannesburg. So they seem to very much be claiming this as a win on their end. Okay, let us move on to our next story. Chris, you recently looked into things that the World Bank had been saying about South Africa's economic condition and our trade. Can you explain a little bit more about what you found?
Yeah, so this recent study by the World Bank reinforces findings, or there's great overlap in findings that we found in a trade paper we released earlier this year at the CRA, looking at South Africa's trade and trade infrastructure and policy space. So the context here is since 2012, South Africa has averaged 0.8% growth, GDP growth per year. That's the climate of low growth, perennially high unemployment. Just today, the latest unemployment numbers released showing again an uptick in the official unemployment rate. I think little surprise there. But one of those areas in terms of trade, if you don't have your basic trade functionality, your ports, your railways, licensing, permitting, border operations, entities like Home Affairs and others, if they don't function optimally to ease the flow of goods, services, people, components, materials, you overall make it more difficult for the economy to grow. You increase the cost of goods for your domestic citizens and businesses, and you make it more difficult for your entities to export. So in South Africa's case, in agriculture, mining, other raw materials, commodities, mining, we just put so many barriers in front of economic growth and economic activity. For all the talk of quote unquote inclusive economic growth, we raise many barriers to new entrants in these different markets because our trade infrastructure doesn't function optimally. One of the big things that the World Bank in its study highlights is the high concentration of South African exports in few products and markets. And that tends to happen when you follow the more protectionist route of subsidies, of providing state support, either in terms of direct subsidies or protections in the form of tariffs for some businesses, when the state tries to identify winners and losers. And finally, with the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, having followed the last few years this route of localization, or the localization master plans, the World Bank refers to those as local content requirements. So ostensibly, those can support some businesses in the short term, but if your economy isn't competitive, if you don't get those basics of macroeconomic fundamentals right, it's almost like you're throwing, I want to say good money after bad, but bad money after worse money. I don't know, because those businesses that get the money have to account for things like inconsistent electricity, high crime rates, moving their goods further because they can't get it through Cape Town or Durban. They have to then ship it to Mozambique or to Namibia. If you don't get some of those things right, this continues. And the World Bank warns South Africa not to follow the protectionist route being followed by some other countries that really should know better, including the United States. That's not to say you can't have a bit of a balance, some sort of balance between your protectionism, some form of support for some local businesses. But when things are weighted so much in that direction, I think you set yourself up over time for less competitive businesses, fewer of them, and ultimately higher costs of goods and products for your consumers.
It's remarkable how our trade and industry policy has in many ways been entirely counterproductive and achieved essentially the opposite of inclusive growth in so many areas. So this is an area of policy that definitely needs to be re-examined by the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. And hopefully the GNU will be able to produce something a little bit less backwards and, counterproductive. Okay, let's move on to our last story for today. And this is about South Africa's foreign policy. There's been a lot of speculation as to whether the government of national unity is actually going to result in any sort of major changes to South African foreign policy. Reportedly within the ANC, this was one of the fears of going into the government of national unity, particularly with the DA, that excuse me, that the presence of the DA would move the ANC away from its stated foreign policy. Ronald Lamola, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, says that South Africa's foreign policy and geopolitical stance won't change, that all parties in the government of national unity had agreed to the country's foreign policy that it should be focused on human rights, solidarity, and peace. The GNU will support multilateralism to achieve a more just, fair, and compassionate world. Well, it seems to be running up a little bit against some of South Africa's other actions. South Africa's foreign policy has long been described in the terms that Lamola has just used. But we see examples all the time of how this is not really the case. When it comes to the South African development community, the sort of local trade bloc in Southern Africa, the SADC annual summit is going to be held in Harare in Zimbabwe, and this is despite significant crackdowns on civil society and human rights groups within the country, and an ongoing record of abuse and human rights abuse in Zimbabwe, with the South African government saying, since the current chairperson of SADC is Zimbabwe, we don't have any authority to actually challenge them hosting the summit. Chris, what do you make of this?
Yeah, it's another in a long line of examples when your rhetoric is in one direction on your foreign policy, on human rights, multilateralism, non-alignment, neutrality on some issues. You want to respect other countries' sovereignty, but you also want to use your platform, maybe in the African Union and others, to push for things like the respecting of democracy, the strengthening thereof, dealing with human rights violations within the abilities that you have and the influences you have. So you talk in that direction, but then you practice differently. So then you engage in these sorts of platforms. I don't want to discount that you can get some wins when you have these discussions and you try and open up avenues of diplomacy, but I really think you undermine your own credibility and the own weight that you might have if you just jump at every single platform and opportunity to quote unquote engage. And when you're in that way, depending especially on how senior officials you send, like your cabinet ministers, you almost sanction what that other government or that country is doing. So does that really, are you doing it for the reasons you state, or is it because you're just desperate to get some sort of attention and be part of some of these platforms? So a very difficult, it's actually, I shouldn't say that. It's not a difficult thing to try and figure out, to practice what you preach, as it were. I know geopolitics and foreign policy has become more complicated now than it was maybe a few decades ago. But that doesn't mean you can't still have certain core values and issues that you focus on and continue to stick to those within the available bounds and platforms that you do have. Because South Africa, it doesn't have the standing that it once had in terms of global geopolitics, and even on the African continent. When you've got conflict between Ethiopia, Eritrea, we've got what's been happening in Sudan, one of the, I think, greatest human tragedies in recent modern human history. And are you actually doing anything to try and solve these issues? I think there's serious questions there.
Indeed. Also, the Democratic Republic of Congo's conflict with Rwanda is another one that comes to mind. I think the most embarrassing thing of this was the statement put out by the Department of Foreign Relations saying that South Africa maintains that political challenges can be resolved by peaceful dialogue. All the issues that are being raised by activists and political organizations can be resolved by sitting around the table with the government of the day. SA will have no problem in playing a facilitating role. In Zimbabwe's case, that is very clearly not even slightly true. And something a little bit more direct needs to be taken if you're actually serious about challenging the status quo there. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. We hope you found the show interesting. That's a wrap. The Daily Friend Show and The Daily Friend are a project of the Institute of Race Relations, the IRR. The IRR is a think tank which was founded in 1929 to study race relations in South Africa and works to change government policy to improve race relations through non-racialism and to ensure the prosperity of all South Africans. If you like our work and would like to support us, please go to irr.org.za and click Support the IRR. Or you can go to thedailyfriend.co.za and click the Fund Us